Welcome back. Now, post-signing the climate change bill into law in July last year, President Ramaphosa has finally proclaimed the act, bringing it into effect as of yesterday. However, a large chunk of the legislation has been deferred, glaringly the section relating to the determination of sectorial emission reduction targets and carbon budgets. It comes at a time when the country has lost climate funding from the US and subsequently gained investment from the EU as the Paris Agreement targets loom. BUSA's Environment and Energy Manager, Happy Khambule, who also a member for the National Energy Crisis Committee, joins us with more insight. Happy, thanks so much for your time this afternoon. So let's start off with that, with the President proclaiming the act yesterday. Talk to me about the significance of this move when it comes to growing the green economy.
All right, thanks for having me, and thanks for the question. Well, the first point here is that largely how we've been dealing with climate change has been under a subordinate legislation within NEMA. And what basically that means is that there were specific provisions that were amended or expanded, at least in terms of interpretation, to allow for us to be able to address some of the key challenges around climate change, namely the reporting as well as some of the indicators around what constitutes greenhouse gas equivalent kinds of emissions. Now, with the climate change bill, or the Climate Change Act in this case, what it allows us to do is that we have a single codified act that essentially looks at the framework in which we will be dealing with climate change. And it also sits under NEMA as well, so it's also a subordinate act to the broader National Environmental Management Act itself, but it specifically focuses on the processes relating to generation of information and what would be held under compliance, as well as the types of activities that are necessary in order to get us on the right track.
All right, so we are on the right track, but the Act has 38 sections, and there's a number of sections that have been deferred. What's the reasoning behind that move, Happy?
Yeah, I think one of the big things that the Act is doing is that the Act itself is hardly substantive. It's quite a procedural bill.
Yeah.
And what it means is that because it's a framework legislation, in a sense, it is required to build in new regulations that are going to give meat to what the provisions are trying to speak to. So, for example, sectoral emission targets, you don't actually get what an emission target would be in terms of the sectors, and you do not know exactly how they're going to be demarcated between the different sectors currently, and the overall mitigation potential that is contained within the sectoral emissions. So you need regulations in order to effect that and give expression to that. So there are a number of regulations, or rather pieces of provisions within the framework legislation that need regulations, and that's the reason why for the delay. Because even the Act itself kind of says after the promulgation of the Act, or when the Act comes into force, these, let's say, for example, sectoral emission targets need to be released 30 days after it comes into force. So obviously the process of developing the sets aren't fully completed, and they still require some form of public participation and stakeholder consultation in order to come out with something. So the delay is in response to the fact that the regulatory or the development of the regulations is not in concert with, obviously, the promulgation, and in order not to be in contravention of that, you delay them up until you're ready.
So then, okay, I understand that you're saying that consultation still has to happen, but then why push through the legislation, why push through the Act when there's so many provisions that we still need to go through? Are we trying to, let's say, perhaps appeal more investor-friendly when it comes to getting financing around climate and the energy transition?
Yeah, I think the first thing is, obviously, it's a signal to the world that we're taking this thing seriously. Okay. I think the world, the business community, society has been looking at the government to say, are you really taking climate change seriously with all the other issues that are emerging? And this is one way of showing that look, even though we are not entirely ready in terms of our administrative processes, the intention is there, and the other prescripts of the Act will still stay. So those will still continue to stay in force, and moving on, this is how we're going to treat this. And then the second part of this is that as soon as these are ready, then the government gets Gazette notice will come out that this
Okay.
particular section is in force. So I think it's one of those ways when you're still building the plane while you're flying, or you're repairing the plane while you're flying, but you're actually trying to get to that destination as soon as possible.
Talk to me about, the private sector when it comes to this, because I guess also the Act will then hold, these heavy emitters more accountable. What's the process been looking like on that front?
Yeah, it's been a bit of a challenge because the two, let's say, two worlds in which we're finding ourselves. The first one is that we have to build regulations that ensure that the behavior as well as the choices and investment decisions that the private sector is taking is in concert with the lived reality that climate change is real and we need to transition, right? So the Act tries to do that. But in the sense, it also isn't, it also has to balance the fact that we're in a particular state of the economy and we play a
Yeah.
particular role in the global economy as well. And the Act is trying to manage that in a procedural way in order for us to at first at least know what the picture is. So the information requirements are quite clear. The need to communicate as well as to disclose pieces of information are quite clear. But the issue around compliance, or if you do not comply with prescripts of the Act, that is still up in the air. So for those, for example, there are companies who are subjected to carbon budgets, and there are those who are not subjected to carbon budgets. If you do have a carbon budget, what does it mean in terms of your non-compliance? What is the remedy that can be resorted to? And then those who aren't part of the carbon budget process, what is their role in order to effect the necessary changes across the economy? So the Act needs to balance that. Then the second part of this is that the Act also recognizes that we are no longer in a world where the public sector has a large chunk of the economy and can then dictate to a smaller portion of the economy, in this case being the private sector, as to what to do. In fact, it has to go both ways. So the private sector takes on commitments and makes targets on the basis of legislation, but so does the public sector need to do the same. So not only is it state-owned enterprises,
Yeah.
there are also provisions that speak to our political principles when they're sitting in office, like MECs and ministers, the presidency, the president, in order to make certain determinations, make certain commitments, and then hold up to those because of the fact that the Act is now applying the same amount of pressure, even at a differentiated level between the private sector as well as the public sector.
A lot of questions left to be answered, but I guess we are in, or rather on the right direction. Happy, thanks so much for your time and just sharing those insights. That was BUSA's Environment and Energy Manager, Happy Khambule.